fall of the Berlin Wall, Europe and the world began a process of transition. From a time when the world was divided by the Cold War, and much of Central and Eastern Europe was imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain. This transformation occurred much sooner than anyone could anticipate, and in a non-violent manner which nobody could imagine 10 years earlier when John Paul II made his first pilgrimage back to Poland, soon after his elevation to Pope. John Paul II took a stand and changed the course of history. He stood up to the Soviet Union and its dominion over Central and Eastern European nations. His words, example, and belief in the dignity of the individual emboldened the Polish people and many others throughout the world to find the courage to resist. He stated that their human and political rights were not granted by the state, but given to them by God. It is this one idea, planted firmly in each man and woman and nourished by John Paul II's words and presence in June 1979, that began the process which liberated over 120 million people living behind the Iron Curtain. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, stated that the collapse of the Iron Curtain would have been impossible without John Paul II. John Paul II was born Karol Wojtyła in 1920 in Wadowice, Poland. His early years were filled with tragedy. When he was 9, his mother Amelia died, and 3 years later his older brother Edmund died. When Karol was 18, he moved to Krakow with his father. Less than a year later, in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and from that point onward, Karol the man and Poland the nation descended into an atmosphere of tyranny that would not end for 50 years. During the Nazi occupation, he would participate in clandestine theater plays, studies, and cultural resistance meetings. These years taught him the value of Polish culture and gave him the courage to later go out and stand up to the oppressive nature of communism. In 1945, with the defeat of the Nazis, the Soviet Union installed a puppet government in Poland, and a new stage of resistance began for Karol Wojtyła. He became a Roman Catholic priest in 1946 and moved on to become the Archbishop of Krakow in 1964. He was named a cardinal in 1967. As the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, his work of liberating the Polish people began. The Catholic faith has always played a significant role in Poland's history, dating from 966 AD. For 1,000 years, the Polish people relied on their Catholic faith and rich culture to persevere, as communism in general, and the Polish government in particular, was trying to eliminate their faith and disconnect the Polish culture from their religion. Cardinal Wojtyła was trying to hold the two together, knowing each was indispensable to the other, and together they would provide the foundation for the Polish nation to move beyond communism. In 1978, Karol Wojtyła became Pope John Paul II. He was the first Slavic pope, and his elevation gave hope to the many nations that were located behind the Iron Curtain. He believed that men and women need to create within themselves a safe space where they can nurture and vigorously defend their dignity. He believed the dignity of the person is inalienable, and no person or government could take it away. The power of this one idea, planted in each man and woman by God and nurtured by their faith and culture, would be the way to diminish and eventually destroy an oppressive system that sought to alienate each person in their own individual prison, in Poland and throughout the world.
And what John Paul II did was to say to the people of Poland, you are not who they say you are. Let me remind you who you really are. You're a people formed by a specific history. At the center of that history is your Christian faith. And at the center of that Christian faith, as it touches public life, is the idea of the dignity of the human person, which is built into us. It's not something the state grants us. It's something a just state must recognize.
In 1979, John Paul II made his first pilgrimage back to Poland. Cardinal Żywiec, who recently retired as Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow and served as the personal secretary to John Paul II for almost 40 years, stated in his autobiography that the return of Karol Wojtyła as John Paul II caused a major change in how people viewed themselves. His presence, according to Cardinal Żywiec, inoculated the Polish people from communism.
Wyzwalał ludzi i narody z lęku. Natomiast Wojtyła przez przepowiadanie wyzwalał właśnie z tego zniewolenia. To była wielka jego siła. Ludzie, jak towarzyszyły, narody, prostowały się, przestały się bać. Niektórzy opowiedzieli, to była największa rewolucja, która się dokonała.
Many call this visit the first domino to fall in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over the 9-day pilgrimage, John Paul II reminded the Polish people of their culture and of their faith. He told them that they had the strength within themselves to persevere, and as 13 million Polish people came to see him speak during this visit, and each saw that they were not alone in this struggle, the seeds of a nonviolent revolution were planted in the fertile ground of Poland. A year later, in 1980, the Solidarity movement was formed in the Gdansk shipyards and quickly spread throughout Poland. The Solidarity movement was the first independent labor union in Poland, and at its peak had over 10 million members. As Lech Walesa recounts, that during his visits, the Holy Father demonstrated how numerous we were. He told us not to be afraid.
Papież tylko obudził naród, pozwolił nam zobaczyć, że nas jest to. Bez Ojca Świętego ten proces by się odbył znacznie później i prawdopodobnie byłby krwawy. A Ojciec Święty przyspieszył procesy i uczynił to, że jednak zważaliśmy nad pokojową.
For the next 8 years, withstanding martial law, arrests, and even the murder of a Solidarity priest, Jerzy Popieluszko, by the Polish government, Solidarity would persevere, and during this time, John Paul II put his support and the support of the Church behind Solidarity and other movements that sprouted up after the creation of Poland's first free labor union. In June 1987, when Ronald Reagan went to the Berlin Wall,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
John Paul II was in Poland, nurturing the Polish people and extolling the virtues of free speech and human rights. The table was set for Poland to take the next step in liberating itself from communism. In June 1989, when parliamentary elections were held on the same day as the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, the Polish people were finally allowed to vote in elections that included Solidarity. The election was exactly 10 years after John Paul II first visited Poland as Pope. Solidarity won an overwhelming landslide victory, and throughout Central and Eastern Europe, nations living under the control of the Soviet Union began to envisage a world where they were no longer separated from their brethren in Western Europe. 5 months later, the Berlin Wall was demolished. From the moment the Berlin Wall fell, over 120 million people effectively became free. Finally, in 1991, after a failed coup d'etat, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the remaining 11 republics of the Soviet Union became independent nations.
We honor you for helping to lead a revolution of values and spirit in Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, freeing millions to live by conscience, not coercion.
Many factors contributed to the fall of communism in Europe. John Paul II will say he had contributed little more than to shake the tree and let the rotten apples fall. It is clear that he lit the match in 1979 that began the process which culminated in the Berlin Wall crumbling down and the Iron Curtain opening up. East and West Europe came together and united. As John Paul II stated, Europe once again could breathe out of both its lungs. The world was a better place because John Paul II took a stand, and the rest is history.
Say pilgrim, a pilgrim in the cause of justice and peace and human solidarity, striving to build up the one human family.